You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to another episode of Ethnocynology. I'm your host, David Ian Howe. I'm an anthropologist and archaeologist. And, this podcast is supposed to be about dogs. I often do talk about dogs. Sometimes I talk about archaeology. One episode we talked about mammoths. This episode, though, will be about dogs are mentioned. Dogs are talked about. I would argue dogs should be talked about more in this episode. I think they should be talked about more and talked about every day in everyday conversation all day, every day. But this episode is about the horse, the other animal that I think humanity owes probably even greater debt to, I would say. And my friend and colleague, Dr. William Taylor, recently wrote a book called Hoofbeats, How Horses Shaped Human History. This is the definitive book on the archaeology and the genetics of horses, or at least the most current one. Dr. Taylor here, is an excellent communicator. He's also a brilliant man. He was also part of Dr. Carlton Shield Chief Gover, who I used to host A Life in Ruins with, who's been a guest on this podcast before. I wasn't his advisor, but he was on his dissertation committee and was one of his professors. He's at UC Boulder, and I'll let him talk from here. But mainly what this episode is going to talk about, actually, this will be a two-part episode. The first episode will be with Dr. William Taylor. The second one will be with, just Cassidy Thornhill. She's the collections manager for the University of Wyoming Archaeological Repository, and she did her master's thesis on specifically the era in which horses were first introduced to the Americas and how they, and before, the modern era of, American colonial expansion, that gray area in between when horses were reintroduced into the Americas and where indigenous peoples were adopting them into their lifeways. And she has a unique thesis question that regards a horse that was found here out west that is a very early horse for the era that was, associated with indigenous peoples before European contact. And again, horses being reintroduced to the Americas as they evolved here, but died out during the Ice Age, and then were reintroduced in the 1500s by the Spanish, or at least late 1400s. That's a topic for a whole other video. It's very complicated and convoluted. It involves a lot of oral tradition versus science stuff, but mainly Will and Cassidy will be talking about that topic in these episodes. But first, this episode, part one, will be with Dr. Will Taylor outlining the evolutionary history of horses, how they, were first used by humans, first early human and horse interaction, how they were first domesticated, how they were ridden, and then also how do you find horses archaeologically, as well as, what I would call ethnoequinopology. Just like ethnocynology, the study of dogs in human cultural contexts, this would be the study of horses in human cultural contexts. And Will and Cassidy are both experts at this. But for this episode, we'll just do Will. This is the audio only version, by the way. I will be doing a video with both of them together that will have a lot more visuals and things like that you can see. But for this episode, if you just wanted to listen to the audio of it, it's a great interview with Will, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Will, and I'll be interjecting here with questions in which I asked him in the interview.
I'm William Taylor. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Colorado.
I first asked Will about his book.
The book is called Hoofbeats, How Horses Shape Human History.
And jumping right into it with the hard science of it, I ask Will, what is the evolutionary history of horses? Can you speak to that? And can you explain to my audience, how, the first hoofbeat, if you will?
This is a question folks have been trying to answer for a long time. It's one of the questions that's probably shifted the most in the last 30 years. Folks have been looking for clues to the first horse domestication, generally in the steppes of Eurasia. Focus has long been, especially on western steppes of Eurasia or Eastern Europe. And the timelines that folks have thrown out range from, tens of thousands of years ago up until more recent centuries. In the last 10 years, there's been a lot of innovation in what we can learn from, especially from ancient genetics. And these have kind of helped us kind of hone in on the when and the where, if not the why, that the ancestors of domestic horses alive today appear for the first time. And it's now pretty clear from looking at that information that the first domestic horses showed up not very long before about 2000 BC. And the place that this first population of domestic horses emerged is the steppes north of the Caucasus Mountains, kind of sandwiched between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Might be more, fresh in people's minds as basically the kind of Ukrainian war zone here today.
I then ask Will, to my understanding, horses evolved in the Americas, but died out, obviously, in the Ice Age once humans arrived and the climate started shifting, or, whatever. The climate started shifting and then humans arrived, or, whatever combination of that you want. But I first ask him, tell me more about horses evolving here in the Americas. Of course, horses are a very iconic American symbol, I would say. We had the bronco and, of course, Plains tribes using them on the plains. So I ask Will, please explain more about horses in the Americas.
Yeah, so the evolution of horses and their relatives alive today, the genus that we know as Equus, really takes us back to somewhere between the last 2 to 4 million years. Depending on whether you ask a paleontologist or a geneticist, you might get a slightly different number, but basically to the beginning of the Pleistocene, the last ice age. And these ancestors definitely came from North America. There were pulses of connectivity linking the Americas with Eurasia and beyond, into Africa. The kind of horsiest of the horses here, we sometimes call caballine horses, spread especially into kind of colder grassland zones of Eurasia and Africa. Even the kind of Mediterranean coast of North Africa would have had some sort of caballine horses in the last ice age. And what we're more recently discovering is actually it's not just one dispersal out of the Americas, but in fact that times that Beringia was connected, there was kind of back and forth going on over the last few million years of high latitude horse populations kind of going one direction or another. But it is true that, basically all the horses of the ancient world, all the horses that are around today, ultimately have a kind of a fundamental North American evolutionary context and shared heritage there.
And from my angle, I always, talk about dogs and humans. Humans arrived in Siberia and they first started interacting with wolves. The first wolves started scavenging our camps and whatnot, or if you want to say humans were trapping them or actively, artificially, selecting for, tamer wolves or whatnot, whatever you want to subscribe to. It's a million different theories on that. But mainly, humans and wolves started interacting and that created the dog. So with that question in mind, I preface Will with that. I ask him, can you tell me more about the earliest, human-horse interactions or human-equine interactions?
So this is a great question, and the answer to it depends a lot on what kind of interaction you're looking for. With horses, it's really interesting that basically horses are one of the first taxa you can really conclusively point to as a prey animal for humans. We have rarely, when you go that far back in human history, do you actually have something that looks like a smoking gun for early hunting. But there are sites, like the most famous one being the site of Schöningen in Germany, in which actual spears used to hunt horses were preserved in the kind of unique depositional context that originally you used to hear the number 400,000 years ago. I think the site recently got redated and is thought now to potentially be associated with Neanderthals at around 200 or so thousand years ago. But there's actually co-occurrence of their butchered horse remains and co-occurrence of early hominins and horses that go back to 750,000 years ago in the UK, and their first moment of being found together in the fossil record is almost 2 million years ago. So these interactions probably go back basically to what it means to be human in latitudes where horses lived, which would have been higher latitude grassland, cooler grassland areas of Eurasia. The relationship took a turn into some other kinds of interactions too that we can see in the earliest human artwork, right? So Paleolithic art somebody did a tally of all the, images of animals in like Eurasian and even North African cave paintings, and found that horses are the most common animal if you just tally up the number of animals in these Paleolithic paintings. And so you start to see horses emerge in artwork, and probably there's a ceremony and belief component to that too at 40,000 years ago. And those are interactions, I think, that are interesting and important. But probably the meat behind your question is when and how did we get into something that looked more like management or domestication, right? And this is a very hard thing to track. It's a very disputed and contentious corner of archaeological science, but the most straightforward indicator we have of a domestic interaction between people and horses is when we find them being buried in human burials with things like chariots and bridal equipment. And that, there's really not a big gap between their genetically our first, appearance of the ancestors of the modern domestic horse and the first appearance of these kind of like transport-focused, burial contexts where we can see spoked wheels and bridles and kind of a chariot culture. So, folks have long been on the lookout for these kind of gradual, multi-century long lead up of shifting interactions. And, it's a little bit hard to say what that process of early horse domestication truly was like. But in my view, it honestly might have been more closer to the snap of the fingers than to this multiple millennia, sort of buildup.
It's also, to my understanding from reading his book and from other places I've seen this, I initially was surprised by this, but one of the early ideas for domestication of horses was that they were originally milked, much like a cow or a goat. And I asked Will to talk about that here too, because that is fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. So one trajectory that people view as playing into the horse domestication these days comes mostly from the site of Botai in northern Kazakhstan. And the idea here is, based on things like the isotope values of ceramic sherds found at Botai, that folks were collecting horse milk, and that milk and meat were sort of the origins of the domestication process with horses. This was a pretty, I think, viable interpretation of the data back when the idea was put together. I think it was based on a kind of a technological approach that, if it's not totally defunct, I think is a little miscalibrated to the question. Today in 2025, it's basically an isotope measurement from a fat residue in a sherd is multiple chains of argument to make that into a milk argument. It's very, very indirect, and there's a lot of room for error. So I'm, in looking back on this now with some of the tools that we have today, and there's been a couple of really interesting papers on this topic recently using much better and more direct indicators of milk in the archaeological record, especially human dental calculus, right, as a way to sort of mineral capsule of the proteins that were actually in people's mouths. And the milk proteins for specific species of animal are actually traceable. So there was this, big survey of a lot of the burials from the North Caucasus over the last, 8,000 years, published in 2022. It didn't find any horse milk until 1000 BC. But it did find milk proteins from across this whole period, right? And, other folks have looked for milk proteins in the Botai site itself and found, sort of come up empty-handed. My view now is that I don't put much credence in the idea that these ceramic lipid residues are associated with horse milk. They're probably from horse fat, but not all that surprising of a conclusion at a site where almost 100% of the animal bones are from horses.
And unlike wolves and dogs who are very sparse in cave art, and you really don't see any rock art images of them until about 10,000 years ago. You don't see any dogs or wolves or even humans for that matter, which is interesting because we're both so intertwined, plus another one for dogs. Horses, though, we do have a lot of evidence, in fact, overwhelming evidence of human-horse interaction, especially through cave art, especially in Chauvet and Lascaux. The Lascaux horse is probably the most iconic image of horses you've ever seen. And, the cave panel in Chauvet, when you hold a torch by it, it looks like they're running. I asked Will, can you talk to me more about that? And one of the earliest symbols of human art is the Vogelherd horse, which is an ivory carving or some kind of wood carving. I think it's ivory of horses, of a horse, I should say. And I asked Will to elaborate on that here.
Yeah, so the Vogelherd horse is a really nice, beautiful example, I think, of horses starting to sort of embed in different parts of human life and culture. It is, one of the earliest representations of human artwork and definitely of horses. And it's extraordinary. It's beautiful. It's abstract, but also sort of anatomically anchored. When I have young kids come to the museum and I want them to understand the sort of gravity and depth of the connection with horses, I give them a little replica of the Vogelherd horse to hold in their hands, because I think it's sort of it travels you back in time to, the relationship between people and horses, tens of thousands of years ago. And, so I view those things with a sort of an awe and a reverence that tell you that there was more to this connection than purely like, what's for dinner, right? In addition to being the number one animal in kind of cave painting artwork, horses are, I believe, in fact, the most frequent animal in terms of zooarchaeological assemblages. They might be in competition with the reindeer and some other, bison, these sort of things for that title. But there are extraordinary archaeological assemblages from across Europe, Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and even, places like Siberia and horse country across Eurasia that show hunting horses was a big deal. And often, we end up with these sites where much or even most all of the fauna from that hunting is that one taxa, right? People had obviously learned that, you can't chase down a horse with a rock or something, right? They run away. That's kind of the whole adaptation. They've evolved to get away from predators. And so our strategies for hunting them reflect a understanding of the landscape, their behavior, their ecology. And we pick their favorite watering hole or their favorite migration corridor and often ambush them, right? So you find these sites that are connected to the landscape and specifically about horses. So you have hundreds or thousands of horse bones here, butchered and reflective of, this kind of very horse-focused choice that ancient hunters made.
And as mentioned previously, horses died out in the Ice Age in the Americas and were reintroduced by the Spanish, though there are, oral traditions and oral histories recently with Yvette Redding Horse Collins and Paulette Steeves, I believe is her name, who wrote 2 books on there, respectively wrote a book. So I asked Will to talk about the archaeological perspective of horses being reintroduced into the Americas and from the historical angle to his knowledge.
There's some interesting archaeological sites that demonstrate that early peoples of both North and South America, were pretty engaged with the kind of homegrown wild horses that lived on the landscape. The sites in the high Beringian Yukon, like Bluefish Caves, that point to folks even before the ice sheets opened up, potentially having a hunter-prey relationship with horses. And around, the kind of Rocky Mountain zone, you have sites like Wally's Beach in southern Alberta, which show that in kind of this Pleistocene-Holocene transition, folks were still sort of hunting horses when they had the opportunity. There's really cool localities, even in places like Florida, that show horse bones being used for tools and some other things which indicate a connection between people and horses here related to the early presence of humans in the Americas. We don't have the most precise model for exactly how those horse populations shifted across North America, but what I can suggest here is that these Ice Age horse populations that did live here were probably pretty cold adapted. And it seems that as the Holocene warmed, the places that those horses were living adjusted a little bit, and it seems to have sort of gradually shifted to higher latitudes. Our last scientific indicator of those horses being present in North America would put us probably at 5,000 or 6,000 years, and it's coming from things like sedimentary DNA in the high Yukon, for example. So kind of along a trajectory that you might find in other taxa, like the mammoth, right? That were really kind of an Ice Age steppe animal, shifting northwards to some degree. It's probable that those, human hunting had a relationship with those animals too. It's much more difficult to say, with any confidence, whether there was some role for hunting in their changing population distributions of the Holocene. But we did a project where we radiocarbon dated and genomically sequenced a lot of the earliest domestic horses that we could find across Western North America. And what we found is that these horses here, pop up across places like southern Wyoming, even as far as Idaho, Kansas, really a broad swath of the American West, show up at around the turn of the 1600s. And these horses are, at least the ones that, have so far been identified here, of kind of a fundamentally Iberian ancestry, right? That means that they're ancestrally connected to populations of horses that were brought over through Spanish settlements further south in North America. I think there's more interesting things to explore about that, but what our research does show is that, this is a much faster dispersal of those horses to very, very far away localities, right? Basically what in the States we would call the Northern Rockies, the edges of the Missouri, most of what we think of as the heart of the American West, very, very rapidly from their first arrival in Spanish settlements, which in mainland North America would have taken place, around, 1520, right? So a few decades is pretty much all it took for horses to go from this kind of, European introduced domesticate that might have been thought of as part of the colonial process here into spreading into places where you're not going to see another European here for, in some cases, decades or centuries, right? And so I think that that's a really interesting and exciting discovery. It does, so far we haven't found any, evidence of a, lingering presence of these kind of Ice Age lineages of horses that were definitely part of this landscape not that long ago, 10, 12, 15,000 years ago in most parts of the American West.
Where horses, if I'm hearing correctly, were basically appeared to indigenous peoples long before European humans showed up. Yeah, and I think, the more that we dig into this, the more complex and interesting that finding has become. I think it's now very possible that European people were not even the vector that spread horses into what is today the United States for the first time. There's historic records and other sort of footing to suggest that native folks in northern Mexico might have had the horse and been helping to spread and disperse and exchange these horses through kind of their own networks of movement and exchange into the Southwest and up the Rockies here, even before you had a permanent settlement in places like, Spanish New Mexico, for example. do we know exactly how horses, were they let loose, or did they just come off the ship, were they traded with indigenous peoples, or in classical Mexico? Or?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and one that I think our thinking has shifted a lot in kind of Western academia. It was often taken for granted that Spanish kept tight control over their horses. In many places, there were literally laws on the books that said, Native people are not allowed to have horses. And I think for a while that was often taken as face value, as evidence that they didn't. More recently, I think, historians have taken a critical lens to that and started to think, well, if there's a law on the books, it sort of implies that there's an underlying problem here to begin with, right? And, we can only make some basic inferences about what was going on that would have helped spread these horses. But it's been interesting to me to see other contexts where you have horses moving into a purely empty landscape on their own as wild animals. One example that's, studied quite a lot on this is Australia, where horses have only been around, roughly 200 years. And so there are areas in which they're sort of spread into landscapes that they were not, is more like measured and documented, and you could even get like a rate. And it turns out, that in those situations, horses are often pretty slow. They're very territorial animals, right? And they're social animals. So they kind of, going into an empty landscape, they're not sort of sprinting as far as they can go to see what's at the end, right? Their mechanisms of dispersal are kind of like, well, can't quite get access to my, compete for control over this harem, and so, maybe I'm going to go nearby and kind of fight over it. And, so ultimately that process, at least from that analogy, is probably not fast enough to explain these kind of extraordinarily, rapid continent scale spreads. We have some other evidence to suggest that, other things like horse equipment spread too. And it looks to me a lot more plausible to suggest that it was really trade and exchange and social networks of people, native folks, that spread horses through most of the American West.
Gotcha. And due to their evolutionary history here, is that part of the reason, I guess in your opinion, why horses do so well here?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting to see, this is one of the more complex issues on wildlife management across the West today, because there are many areas in which horses do extraordinarily well. And in fact, horses are doing well in areas that I don't think anybody would classify as like great horse habitat, but they're simply there because, it's sort of a remote area. They're very, sort of successful and adaptable animals, and in areas with like a low population density and that sort of thing, they can kind of get away with it. But it was not that long ago that there was wild horse populations in a much more extraordinary scale across the West. And I think their ancestral connection to, the kind of Pleistocene ecology of the Americas definitely plays a part in that. Horses are grassland animals, and they're good ones, and we have a lot of grasslands. Over the centuries since their domestication, horses have also, managed to be adapted to both human and human adjacent environments pretty well. They've gotten much more successful in warm environments. The path of the horse through the Americas is not simply from, the Eurasian steppes into, Colorado or Wyoming. It was via, the Arabian Peninsula and North Africa to Iberia to Mexico, right? And so these animals that are around today have, probably not suffering some of the same, ecological challenges that might have faced down your Pleistocene horses too. So I do think that their success in the American West speaks to, in many ways, some of that evolutionary history. It also speaks to some of that long-term domestication history. And I think that's part of what makes it such a complicated topic.
This might be a little anachronistic here, but I thought in the interview to ask this here. How do you identify horses archaeologically? Because it's very hard to find dogs and wolves archaeologically, because you just have to happen to stumble upon them or find them in butchered remains at sites. And also you can't really tell the difference between horses, you can definitely tell the difference between a horse and a wolf, but you really can't tell the difference between dogs and wolves in the past. That's why the answer to domestication is so complicated and debated and discussed, I should say. Maybe not debate. Well, it's debated and discussed. Why it's a topic of conversation. With that, I ask Will here, how do you find horses archaeologically? What's the basis for your knowledge here?
For horse domestication? So one of the amazing things about horses is that our search for domestication is very closely wrapped up in the search for horse transport. And horse transport, is this big, mechanical, challenging process, right? That leaves pretty remarkable indicators on the actual, living tissues of a horse, which include their bones, right? We as humans know that our bones respond to our repeated sort of choices, activities that we make in life. It's why my knee hurts from basketball and my lower back, is sort of locking up from sitting there writing emails, 10 hours a day, every day. So we all are sort of familiar with the idea that our bones are responding in many ways to activities. Horse transport, carrying a human rider or pulling a big heavy cart, is sort of on the extreme end of the mechanical activities that animals will go through. And what we've been able to sort of build an understanding of over the years is that almost any kind of horse transport, doesn't matter whether you're riding without a bit or riding without a saddle, or almost any flavor or variation of horse transport you want to come up with, is going to leave some kind of an indicator in the animal skeleton that's potentially recognizable. And I think that's what differentiates in many ways our search for clues to horse domestication from some of these other human-animal relationships where you don't have that transport element. It is a much more direct link between the human-animal interactions and the skeleton of the animals themselves. So that's by far and away our best and most direct indicator of domestication in horses, in my view. Now, there's also some artifacts that kind of follow along with that, right? One of the most useful here is the equipment used to control horses themselves. And we have, with horses, apparently, a unique technological innovation that is the sort of bridle with a mouthpiece, right? Or what we would call a bit, right? So there are material culture indicators of that horse transport that go along with the skeletal ones. They're not totally without their challenges. A lot of the early horse equipment was organic, and so you often only get the rigid components made out of bone or antler that survive, and there can be ambiguity in finding those. And of course, there are other things that join the fray and the search too. Oftentimes, as with dogs, as with other animals, one of the most compelling and hard to interpret things is their appearance in things like a burial or that sort of thing. They speak to an intimacy, but they're also kind of a reading the tea leaves kind of a situation. So later on in the journey, you end up with things like historic records and art and some things that are, almost impossible to argue with. So
along those lines, something that also, in his book and when he was previously interviewed on A Life in Ruins, I can't remember the episode number, but that's besides the point. He mentioned that, horse riding is almost way more recent than the domestication of the horse, for sure. It's like they basically just got horse riding at the time of the Iliad, which is the Bronze Age, ancient Greece, and the islands and the coast of Turkey along the Aegean Sea there. So I did ask Will here, what's the earliest evidence of writing and how do we find that? And am I wrong in that presumption?
Yeah, so one of the, I think, more confounding aspects of the archaeological record is you don't actually see direct evidence for horse riding a whole lot in the archaeological record early on. So the first chariot burials show up around 2000 BC, and in a lot of the early, depictions, artwork, historic records, it's like chariot across, Eurasian archaeological sites. That doesn't mean that people weren't riding horses. And in fact, I think, in the book, I go into detail as to what are some of the earliest contexts where we see clear, indisputable evidence for horse riding. One of them are these incredible murals from ancient Egypt in the New Kingdom, right? So horses introduced into Egypt in the 1700 BC-ish time period by probably through foreign invaders, right? And sort of bring an end to the old kingdom. By the time the New Kingdom starts to get its act together, horses are really much a part of sort of representations of authority and power. And if you ever go to like Luxor or some of these places, you can see these incredible entire buildings painted with the horse, army of Ramses the Great. And if you look closely at some of these, not just Ramses, but some earlier ones too, you can see that they're amidst these massive chariot battles that are depicted on here. You can see some little horse riders hiding off in the side. They're usually like naked. They're often sitting in kind of a weird position on the horse, a little bit further back than you would think you would normally sit. They're often doing something very specific, like holding a message or something like that. And kind of an interpretation of this is that it's not that people couldn't ride horses, and clearly in some cases they would choose to do so. But I think these contexts show you that there was a trade-off to horse transport in the early days, right? That it was chosen when things like speed were being prioritized over safety and control. And when you wanted to do something super chaotic, like bring your, guys on with horses into a combat situation, people were making different choices as to how to do that effectively. And one of the things that probably played a role in this is the technology that we actually used to control horses. Remember, I said the first horse equipment was mostly organic. So people literally, with the Sintashta culture at 2000 BC, just had like a soft piece of probably leather in the animal's mouth. Imagine your level of control of trying to take a horse into battle, with that sort of a framework, and then it chews through the leather or something like that. Across the second millennium BC, you see experimentation with new ways to control a horse. You see new kinds of bit appear. Bits get made out of metal. They're initially still these kind of straight metal bars. And right around the time you start to see horses in like your Egyptian artwork and whatever, you actually have the invention of the kind of jointed metal mouthpiece, which I don't think it was a magic bullet for, blink your eyes and you had horse riding, but I think it started to allow people to communicate a little more urgently and effectively with nuance in high intensity situations in a way that the horse could kind of mechanically understand. And we see, different trajectories in different parts of the world in terms of when horse riding started to be used in battle. And I think there's a lot of parallels between the equipment side and the cavalry side of things with horses. One of my other favorite little snapshots into the logic of early horse transport, probably the first depiction of cavalry being used in a dated archaeological context, comes from Assyria around 900 BC. And if you look closely, and there's a panel of this actually in the book, it's actually two riders riding side by side. One's got the bow and arrow, and the other is holding the reins. And I think it's suggesting that horse control was messy, right? At 2000 BC, we basically still had a wild animal here, kind of zebra level behavior, trying to get them to do things with transport and battle and these sort of things. So as horse breeding and selection made the animals more tractable, friendlier, more controllable, we also had changing technologies that allowed us to do more sorts of mechanical communication with the horse that I think opened up the possibility of using them in other ways, and when you didn't need to sort of cling to their back naked with your message, and you could do more complex and dangerous things while you're actually on the animal's back, which is a very, evolutionarily, we're talking about one of humanity's first prey animals. To be sitting in their sort of blind spot on their back is quite a spot to be physiologically, emotionally, behaviorally for the horse. And I think that first transport system, the chariot system, probably that was just a little more stable, comfortable, manageable for the horses. Another instance of that is in the early 20th century, people even effectively used zebras in a lot of these kind of chariots and carts in different corners of the world, New York, South Africa, this sort of thing.
Finally, the meat of it that I think most people would be interested in is what I would call ethnoequinopology. There might be a more specific word for horses, not just equids in general, because that can count zebras and donkeys, but it's all the same, really. Ethnoequinology, like what's I believe in the interview I preface Will with this, most of my research comes from dogs, from oral histories and early ethnographies of Spanish and French and American explorers here in the United States and in Australia for that matter as well, how dogs and humans interacted with each other culturally. And obviously ethnocynology is a study of dogs in human cultural context. So dogs being used as food items or dogs being used as beasts of burden to pull sleds and things like that. I ask Will, in the horse sense, can you explain your perspective of that? Because horses are obviously crucial to the human story.
Most of my connection with horses from a research perspective comes out of time spent here in the American West and time spent in the steppes of Mongolia. And I think both of those experiences have given me a sense of the sort of intensity and depth and reverence and connection that people living in horse country have developed over the centuries. For me, the most extraordinary, I think, snapshots into that come out of Mongolia, which is not surprising. It's been for at least 3,500 years, one of the most horse-connected places on the planet. And in Mongolia culture today, when a horse passes away, folks will take the head of that horse and put it in a place of reverence. So you can go to a mountain pass and feel like you're in the middle of nowhere and come across an enormous stone cairn that has, prayer flags and the skulls or heads of dozens of beloved horses that have passed on and then have been treated with this sort of reverence and respect that it's hard for that to not feel like a spiritual type of experience and connection. And that, in my interaction and engagement with especially with Native folks here in the Western U.S., you can kind of feel some of these parallels and similarities in terms of the link between horses and people's belief in the world around them. And so that's pretty special in my view.
After some chatting in between that last question and the next one, Will brings up two further examples that he recalled and wanted to address here too. So first one will be in Australia, and the next will be another place that you'll have to wait to listen to.
Oh, I'll pick another anecdote here that I think is pretty special because it's a corner of the world that doesn't get a ton of respect for being a horse culture. It's often thought of and framed as in Australia, and in fact most of the Pacific, Australasia as well, that horses are purely a tool of sort of colonialism, right? But there's a rock art site in Queensland, in a place called Lara, that has the most extraordinary mural of a giant horse in kind of the northeastern coast of Australia, painted by Aboriginal folks here, that I think is this beautiful testament to their connection with horses and the emotional, spiritual, but also I think, logistical connection between native folks and horses in other corners of the world, even if the time depth, even though the time depth has led people to maybe dismiss the significance of those connections.
And as promised, we'll, mention another fascinating place where ethnoequinopology, exists that's very interesting and intriguing to him, and I let him explain that here.
In terms of anecdotes about horses too, I think one of the most exciting chapters of the story that doesn't get into our school curricula and history books here in the U.S. is the connection of people and horses in South America, in Patagonia, in the Pampas. Really some incredible horse cultures down in this region. And one of the things, I was lucky enough to work with a team of Argentinian archaeologists on some early horse sites, really at the southern tip of Patagonia, the edge of the world, the edge of the continent. And we found there is the same pattern we see here in North America, which is that horses spread extraordinarily fast. They got deeply integrated into, native indigenous cultures down there. And, the world that emerged in the Pampas here was one in which, people would run away to go live in the horse cultures of the Pampas, right? In which there was like trade and economy and sovereignty of again, almost a continent in scale in terms of the scope of these sort of networks and polities that emerged this important and globally significant grassland. And it's sad, I think, that the scope of that, their kind of cultural achievements as a horse culture often kind of get overlooked there. So we did a little bit of archaeology on that, and it's one of my favorite parts of the book too.
So that concludes the full interview with Will, or Dr. Taylor, I should say, as you should refer to him. Lastly, I asked him, is there anything else in the book that you think people should do or learn or know, or why they should grab the book? Again, that's called Hoofbeats, How Horses Shaped Human History, and I'll let Will talk about that here.
I just would encourage folks to check out the book. I think there's only so much you can share in a short interview, and the book is really kind of for the folks that would like to dive into the nitty-gritty. I'm a visual person, so there's a lot of pretty pictures, and one of the things that I try to do is take us around the world to places that might not always pop up on your list of horse cultures, West Africa, the Pacific, and get into the archaeology of the story of people and horses in those places too.
So that concludes episode 22. That was with Will. The next episode will be with Cassidy Thornhill, where she highlights her research, of her master's research, I should say, that is a specific site found in the Americas of what we used to call proto-historic, the area after 1492, before the full American, pioneering or colonial expansion into the West, before the Americas were fully, civilized is not the word to use, but, colonized, I guess would be the word, right? Until it was fully settled. That's the word I'm looking for, like pioneers and settlers, right? Proto-historic would be that era from 1492 until the Oregon Trail, after the Indian Wars, the era in which horses and, to my surprise, there were horses. Native tribes saw horses that were released from the Pueblo revolts and whatnot, and other instances in which they were, let loose or otherwise lost and went rewilded into the Americas, because again, they evolved here and they're ecologically and evolutionary adapted to this specific landscape. There were places where natives found or encountered horses before they ever saw a white person, possibly by hundreds of years, or at least, decades in certain places. And Cassidy found a specific site for her master's thesis where one of these horses was found. And it's really, interesting and insightful. So the next episode will cover Cassidy's, research on that. But that concludes this interview with Dr. William Taylor. Please check out his book. I have enjoyed it. It is a quick listen on Audible, and I also have a copy of it right here that I've been using to write my book because I have to cite a few things from it. And I also want to make sure I'm not copying something he has to say about dogs verbatim. That's Hoofbeats, How Horses Shaped Human History. You can find that on Amazon or anywhere you get your books. And thank you very much. Please rate and review the podcast on Apple and Spotify. Just hit the star button. It's not hard. Just do that. It really helps not only me, but the APN. It helps other shows on the APN that are also great get attention. So please do that. Thank you very much. And again, this will be on a larger video with some more topics interspersed between Cassidy and Will in a YouTube version that's more documentary style, where you can see a lot more of the pictures and things like that. But this interview, the full interview, is what you're getting here in the podcast, and this is the extended one that won't be in the full video. So congrats, you got to hear that here first. So thank you very much.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.